Okay, today I'm going to be interviewing a longtime friend of mine. He's a co-worker and with me at Cycling 74. He's also a collaborator on many musical projects. He and I have recently released an album on Palace of Lights. And additionally, we've done a lot of performing together. I find him one of the most fascinating people in my life, and so I'm really happy and excited to share share Gregory Taylor with you, the listeners. Hi, Gregory. How are you?
Hi. No pressure, huh?
No pressure at all. That's right. Well, it's I want to throw that out there because it is true. You seem to have such an encyclopedic knowledge of things, and I always learn something new every time we have a discussion. So there you go.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Well, as you probably know from this podcast, one of the ways that we tend to start our conversations is by asking people to give us a little bit of their background, tell us something about their background. And as you well know, sometimes it's performance related, or it's where they went to school, or it's how mean their dad was to them. So I'll let you kind of pick, but if you could kind of fill us in a little bit on how you got to be the person you are.
Well, the longer one lives, the longer that story gets. So I'll do what I can to compress it as much as possible. I think I'm one of those people that started out pretty ordinary as a kid. I guess the only thing I can think of that really set me on the course at a really young age to the person that I am now is that the public library, when I was in seventh grade, moved all of the records up from the basement where you couldn't get at them to a giant rack of shelves along the wall of the library. That was the same year that I could take stuff out with my library card. So I started checking records out of the library. And for some reason that I will always be grateful for, my mother and father suggested that if I was going to be bringing all these records home, then the smart thing to do would be to listen to them on the family's new set of headphones on our stereo. And so the earliest memory that explains the person that I am is that I'm one of those kids who grew up listening to all kinds of music that I could kind of randomly choose from with no adults around to tell me what was good or bad or interesting. And when I think back over all of the things that's happened, it's the foundation for my love of what we now call phonography, sight recordings. It's the origin of my interest in things like sound effects, unusual musics, and particularly in the case of my own life with non-Western musics in general. That's the first time I got to hear that. My later education was pretty much normal high school stuff. I sort of goofed around and played in bands. When I was in college, I had a little trouble deciding what it was I wanted to do, and it sort of came down to choosing between degrees in literature and philosophy and the visual arts. And I wound up in the visual arts because it was the least number of credits that I needed to graduate, and money was tight. So my only degree is a BFA in painting, which probably surprises most people now. After I left college, I played in a bar band in North Carolina with one of my best friends, and wound up acquiring, a bunch of instruments that you need to do that, and decided that at some point that although I really loved the people that I played with, I was playing music that, I maybe wasn't all that great at. I would probably burn with shame if I heard live recordings of my band now. But I was playing music in places I kind of wouldn't go, for people I wouldn't necessarily hang out with, and it really bothered me because I was playing it with my best friends. But I just decided maybe it was time to do something else. And so I kept a bunch of my gear, moved back up north, and got a temp job working at Fermilab. I was cutting foil into 3-inch strips, actually, as it turned out. And I wound up going to their library. And since there wasn't any security in the place, they just let me check books out. And I kind of got in trouble for it later, but my boss decided if I was interested in reading about what I was doing, he'd give me a better job. And to make a long story short, one of the other things that kind of explains me, I think, in a pretty good way to people is that I'm one of those people who spent his entire working life doing kinds of work that are kind of, what do we say, too tedious and boring for really smart people and too weird for regular people. So the idea of being a painter who worked at Fermilab and Bell Laboratories and the Theory Center for Simulation at Cornell University, those things don't make any sense unless you think of it that way.
Right.
And that is to say, you kind of learn how to teach yourself.
Sure.
And should I explain to them how I know David Ziccarelli?
Well, I don't know how you know David Ziccarelli, actually.
You actually don't? Okay. No. Well, so here's the deal. Many people ask me, many people mistakenly assume I must be one of the smartest kids in the room, and because I work for Cycling 74, and they always want to know how I got my job or how I met David. I married a woman who was getting her PhD in German and Dutch at Cornell University when I was working at Bell Laboratories. And since I was in love and it was the right thing to do, I left my job at Bell Labs and I moved to Ithaca, New York, where getting a job was really difficult because the person that waited tables for you at the coffee shop had a PhD in comparative Vietnamese literature. And I was just some geek generalist who did evaluation of diagnostic computer protocols at Bell Labs, which wasn't a very hireable skill. Anyway, I finally did get a job explaining computing to terrified tenured professors. Again, one of those jobs that's too difficult for regular people and too tedious for smart people. While I was working there, I started doing live performance. I was kind of interested in doing by this time, I was kind of making and releasing cassette recordings, which we can talk about later if you want. But I started doing live gigs. And part of the reason to do that was if you did gigs at some of the places in town, particularly the Cabbage Town Cafe, which was this great vegetarian place, is you had a choice of getting money for the gig or like twice to three times as much credit at the cafe. Mm-hmm. So, of course, since my wife's a grad student, we were poor as church mice. Right. So I thought, this will be awesome, a couple of free meals. And there was this guy who came to my gigs. He was a college kid, and high school kid. His dad, I think, was a professor at Cornell, maybe an engineering guy or something. Anyway, he played keyboards in a couple of local bands, and he was this like really cool, happy, smiley guy. And you'd do these wacky ass gigs, and he'd come up to the end and he'd say, "Wow, that was really neat." And he was just like, he was a great guy. I always loved to see him. And so the time came that my wife was getting ready to finish her PhD, and she got a job teaching at the University of Wisconsin. And so it was time to have like goodbye gigs because I was going to move.
Right. And
we did my last goodbye gig, and he came to my gig, and he was the kind of guy he'd like help you load stuff into the car when you were done and things like that. And he was saying, well, and I said, gosh, Doug, I'm really going to miss you because it seems like you're always at my gigs, and I look out in the audience and I see you there, and it just makes me happy, and it's going to be weird to ever perform again and not see you. And he said, oh man, don't worry. I'm going to move to California. I got a job working for a software company. And here's the part of the story that's kind of a little weird. I was playing in the gamelan ensemble at Cornell. And one of the things I was really interested in doing was using those tuning systems to do the kind of electronic music that I did. So I had a friend who worked at Texas Instruments in Texas who disassembled ROMs for a living. That was his job. And we got to talking about it, and I said, so if you could disassemble the tuning ROM on the old DX, so this is not the DX72s, the very first ones, could you burn me a new chip that would give me the scale on the Cornell University gamelan? And he thought about it for a while, and he said, well, yeah, sure, send me the chip. So I dug it out of my DX7, stuck it in the mail to him, and I don't know, a month and a half back, this thing came back, and he said, put this in, turn it on, and lo and behold, it played my thing. So I was doing gigs in non-Western tunings, which was kind of odd for that. So anyway, we're
Right.
talking about this thing, and I said, it's going to be, and he said, well, gosh, and not only am I going to California, but there's going to be a new DX7 coming out, and you're going to be able to tune it yourself. You won't have to do this like ROM stuff. It'll be great. And I'm like, holy cow, that's fantastic. And I said, so how do you know this? And he said, well, the company I'm working for is going to make tuning programs for this. And actually, I was kind of wondering about, you're like the only person I know that does anything with non-equal temperament. When I get my job and we start working on this tuning editor thing, do you think I could like call you and ask you questions about stuff? And I'll give you a free copy of the software for it. And I'm thinking, free copy of the software? This is awesome. Sure, man, no problem. So we moved to Wisconsin, and he moves out to California. And at a certain point, I hear back from him, and he says, "Well, I'm going to be working on some other projects, but there's this other guy that works with our company who probably is going to be doing this. And so, is it okay if I put you in touch with him?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, "Don't worry, the deal's still on about the software and stuff." I said, "Sure, no problem." And a little while later, this guy called me, and he was David Ziccarelli. And since the really great part of the story is the guy who used to come to my gigs was Doug Wyatt, who's now like OMS, Core Audio. He's, pretty important guy at Apple, but I knew him when he was like a really happy, great piano player. And so that's how I met David, and I knew David for years and years. We just call up every couple of months and say, "What are you listening to? What are you reading? What are you working on?" And that's sort of how I got to know David. And sometime way later, a decade later, he asked me if I wanted to do some work for Cycling 74. And when you get asked a question like that, you just kind of don't turn it down, because he's such a great guy. It was software that I used. I thought it would be great. So that's how I got to be more or less where I am. What else do you need to know? Oh, the only other thing that might be interesting to know about me is that I do and have done for nearly 30 years a radio program of experimental music on the radio, in addition to that other stuff. And let's see, when my wife goes to the Netherlands on sabbatical or for research trips, I tag along. And during one of those trips, I was enrolled at the world famous, little known, little understood Institute of Sonology, which is one of those things that people who know me are a little bit surprised about. But I was actually a sonologist in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So that's pretty much who I am, I guess.
Well, there's an awful lot that was just presented there, and it's funny because you do the Midwestern ultra laid back, I'm not the smartest guy in the room kind of thing, really pretty pervasively. But the flip side of it is you kind of had your thumb on an awful lot of interesting things over the years. I mean,
yeah, I got lucky that way, or I was lucky enough to be interested in that stuff, and also to have friends and acquaintances who didn't think that a lack of credentialing, I'm not sure what the word we want is, but who saw no reason not to try to explain something that I was obviously interested in and passionately curious about. And also left over from my old days as like a 7th grade kid with headphones on listening to the BBC's Murder, Mystery, and Mayhem sound effects records. I had the chance to kind of think about the things that interested me without having a lot of people around telling me what I should and shouldn't find interesting.
Well, I think that's really interesting because that sort of undirected exploration is something that I think we don't do very much anymore. And I noticed this really seriously when the university I teach at, where they decided to make the library less about a place for book storage and more about like a meeting place and a media space, right? So they took all their books pretty much out of the building and shoved them into a warehouse downtown. Wow. And then basically said, okay, you can search for books, and if you find something you want, just pull it and we'll have it here. We'll have shuttles going back and forth constantly. We'll have it here in an hour.
Yeah.
And I
That was
found,
my old public library. If you wanted to get a record,
yeah,
that's what you had to do. You couldn't pull things down off the shelf and look at the covers
right,
and find like a lady wearing a woman wearing a skimpy dress, and that would be really cool. And because of course I'm in seventh grade,
right,
right?
because you'd
So
have
I
to
check it
find
out.
that out, right?
It's Martin Denny,
Oh, how funny!
right? So that's again, I wound up looking at cool stuff for maybe the wrong reasons, but when the number of options available to you are open, the possibility for surprise goes way up.
Right. Well, and like in the case of this library, I find that the amount of interesting stuff I bring home from the library is almost nil now, because what I had found, and what I've always found with libraries, is that the book that I really want is never the one I'm looking for.
Yeah, you
It's
can't
always the one
browse.
it's always the one that's like down two shelves
Yep.
and over
Yep.
to the right a little bit,
That's exactly right. And when you think of it, one of the real ridiculous problems of our enabling technologies is that just about the only people who pay attention to that particular loss, in other words, the idea of thinking of a bookshelf as a kind of field of vision, which has something randomly to do with the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress or whatever system you use. The only people who think about versions of that in the electronic world are trying to sell us something,
right.
right? So there's nobody who kind of provides ways for us to browse an idea, unless you're willing to like spend, you know, lots of time with search engines, which is always for me why, and again, this goes back to the people who assisted in the formation of my sensibility. Unless you have trusted agents, like little weirdos planted in weird places, where you can basically, people to whom you can go and say, can you tell me a little bit about what you're really interested in?
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of watch to see when they lean forward, or when they lower their voice, or when their description of something drops to a conspiratorial whisper.
Right.
And you think, oh man, this is it.
This is the good stuff. Right?
Oh, totally.
Because I feel like a lot of how I got to be what I am was from a similar thing of doing the stuff that was uncommon, and doing it because nobody told me. Well, I certainly got the hint from my fellow students that it was not cool, right?
Yeah, me
But
too.
I didn't really care because I wasn't particularly cool anyway.
Well,
But
or in some cases, there's no sometimes after a lot of thought, or sometimes after no thought at all, you realize there's kind of no point in not finding something interesting,
right,
right? That what in the end, I mean, we all want to be accepted, we all want to be interesting, we all want to be loved, but kind of in the end, only listening to people who we think are going to be successful, because that's a moving window if ever there was
yeah,
one,
really,
isn't going to help us do that. And that often we find ourselves in situations where we get to where we are by some bizarre, lovely means. Like, I would never have probably gone to work for Cycling 74 had I never been unworried about going to a vegetarian restaurant with a bunch of juice glasses, physical tape loops, and Reebok 77 things that I would like strew around the inside of the store and make something that looked ridiculous.
right,
Had that not happened, I would never be where I am today. So every time I think of doing something stupid, and that often occurs to me, to be honest, because I do dumb stuff all the time. I guess I feel like I'm really lucky to have had situations where the dumb stuff I did how do I say this? The dumb stuff I didn't work out the way that I thought. So I
Right.
wasn't able to come away from the experience and say, yep, I planned that out. You don't really get to do that. But the thing that happens instead is actually better than you thought you were going to get. And then the only thing you have to work, the only like personal trial after that is whether you want to lie about it and
Right.
imply, well, yes, I planned that from the beginning. I mean, that's because a lot of self promotion is about that, as opposed to saying, you know, I just, it just, it just happened,
It
and
fell out of the sky.
I'm as surprised about it as you are.
Right.
Yeah, and when I think of lots of my experience of collaborating with people, I think when I was younger, maybe I had the idea that I was that it would be really good of me to choose people who to work with to play with people that I respected more than people I liked. Boy, that's a little complicated, but just bear with me. So there was this idea that I thought what was going to make me better or great or cooler or whatever was going to be finding somebody I really respected and worked really hard with them, even if we didn't get along or we didn't, despite all those other things, something magical was going to happen as a result of it. And a lot of the time it didn't. And I would go in, I'd feel really horrible, and I'd think, oh, I'm never going to get anywhere, and my self-promotional skills are awful. And at a certain point, I realized that playing with people that I liked was a great place to start. First, because I was lucky enough to know some people that I liked who were willing to accept me and were really great and interesting musicians. And playing with people you like has a sort of an interesting side effect. First of all, you feel accepted, so you can take risks. In some cases, risks you wouldn't even take with yourself because
Right.
somebody trusts you, right? You can do that. But secondly, you can be surprised
Hmm.
in ways that you don't surprise yourself. In fact, when I think about the work that I'm doing now, remember how we talked about unintended consequences?
Right.
I have an interesting unintended consequence right now, and that is at a certain point, I had this body of solo work, and I had people that I trusted with handling the work. You yourself, in fact, as my mastering engineer, know this as well as anybody. People I would say, I trust you to make the best of this. This is as far as I can take this thing. At a certain point, when I started playing with people, I realized that there was this thing that only happened when I did that. And the thing had something to do with the fact that despite all of my talk about algorithmic stuff, I wasn't as good at being surprised and displaced in a way that got me to do something different as working with other people. The unintended consequence, the first unintended consequence was I just love the people that I work with. It's a ball to be in the groups that I work in. The unintended consequence is when that's over and it fades and you go back to working alone, you realize you sit down in the studio and you think, how am I going to surprise myself? What on
Right.
earth can I possibly do that wouldn't be what I expect? And I confess that's I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that these days.
Surprise can come in so many ways too. I mean, the surprise can come from you making what you would consider an error and somebody taking that and turning it into
Oh yeah.
a highlight, right?
Yep.
Or someone misconstruing what you've done and assuming that the one of a rhythm is in a different place and changing the accenting completely.
Exactly.
Those kinds of
Exactly.
things are pretty amazing. So, you were pretty circumspect there about who you might have collaborated with that wasn't necessarily a friendly situation. But I want to go back to something you talked about earlier a little bit, which is your interaction with the cassette culture.
Oh yeah.
Now, we haven't had a lot of people on the podcast yet who were kind of into the cassette culture thing.
Well, a lot of them weren't old enough.
Right. Well, there's that. But even those who are, I think, have a tendency to view that as a transitional phase for themselves.
Oh, not for me, not at all. Oh no. Um, so for those of you for those of you who may not know it, if you're really young, you're probably accustomed to thinking that cassettes are kind of cool. There was a period of time a lot earlier than now, and I would date it from the middle late 1970s all the way up to kind of the 90s, where there was an entire culture composed of people who did almost all of their work in small runs as cassette recordings. And there was a whole, not only were there a ton of people who did it, and it's not true that everybody knew everyone else, but it was really widespread. But also there were sort of organizations and modes of distribution, and particularly things like magazines, like Op, which turned into Option later on, and magazines like Sound Choice, who basically that was kind of the place where those people met. I started working on it because after I left and moved back up north, I still had some of my gear left over. I mean, there was some stuff that you just didn't really carry around that much because it was too heavy. You know, humping a B4 up and down the stairs to your third floor apartment, it doesn't work. Right. However, the little MIDI cord, oh yeah, no problem. Or the Krumar string on, that. So I had that stuff. And a friend of mine who is basically moving up in the recording studio world decided to sell a 4-track recorder, and I bought it. And so I had this like great recorder. A friend from this bar band I played in North Carolina had moved back up north. He was interested in having me do some work with him and helping to produce, because I always had quote unquote good ideas. And so I went into the recording studio. I'd never really done any multi-track recording before. And the other thing to remember is, since I was still a visual artist in those days, I was doing work that was that took forever to dry. So it was this like dense kind of layered stuff, and you'd lay something down and you'd have to wait a week for it to dry and then do something else. And so I was doing this like slow kind of work. So I went into the recording studio to work with my friend, and it was a ball. You could do stuff that was, it sounds so silly to say this now, but it was the first time that I ran across this idea that a recording, the purpose of making a recording is not to make a document of a perfect event, but rather it's this thing that you can kind of put down and erase, and you're transferring something in the air to a discrete symbolic domain, a like piece of tape that you can like cut. I know this, gosh, this sounds so stupid to say, but it was like the heavens cracked open and a giant bolt of lightning dropped on my head and said, well, you know what? As long as this was on tape, there's no reason in the world you can't goof around with the tape. Instead of goofing around with the performance, goof around with what you made it into and make that into something else. And moreover, since you're doing that, you could do something where like the only person making any noise on this whole recording, this giant band, is nothing but you. At which point, of course, your inner adult wakes up and says, well, wait, you can't play that, or you don't actually have any real talent. Well, happily, the inner adult was not somebody I was listening to in those days. So I started doing these cassette things. And since I read Option when it came out faithfully every 2 months, I sent it off to Option. And it got reviewed. And the person that reviewed it didn't say it was a sucky piece of nonsense by some lame charlatan who never had a good idea. You know what I mean? Like the things you're afraid of didn't happen. It was like, gosh, this is really interesting. These are like imaginary cultural artifacts. I think it was like one of the first reviews I ever got. And I like read the thing first. I was completely excited, as you might imagine. But I read the thing and I thought, imaginary cultural artifact. And then I thought, well, actually, when I think about the kind of painting I'm doing, that's really what I'm doing. And so all of a sudden I had an informing metaphor for who I was going to be. And that was, I was going to make imaginary cultural objects. I was going to imagine societies whose rituals I would document in detail. And if I was really lucky, there would be people who would not realize that the rituals were entirely made up.
Right.
Yeah. And after that, it was, it was a great, you hate having people tell you long after time has passed something like, it was a great time to be doing work. But you know what? It was. It was on the other side of the whole DIY punk ethos, the idea that this particular kind of music had, like, I don't want to say no cultural capital, but its medium of exchange, or its currency exchange rate, was wildly fluctuated wildly. And it wasn't like the art world in the 80s where suddenly people started making millions of dollars. It was, everybody was still scrabbling, and so the playing field was flat. And that has arisen again, but in a very, very different way now. But I was so lucky to have been around when I was, and to have that community be the net that I fell into.
Right. I find it fascinating that, different people travel different paths and either do or do not fall into these sort of safety nets of loving community.
Yeah.
Totally arbitrarily.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And every time I see, every time you walk by somebody who's in obvious psychic distress, I guess this marks me as a sort of bizarre, overthinking, guilty white liberal, but I guess what I feel like is there are people who find themselves in positions of great pain and psychic suffering because there was no community among whom they moved who was willing to call them back onto the path. And I got really lucky in the sense that there was this whole sort of modality about coming to think about the world and things that you could do that were not dangerous and didn't brand you as a pariah. And I sort of think about like how my life would have been had I not had that as a means of expression. You don't want to say, it always feels funny to say something like the ability to do art or the ability to tunnel into this little microculture saved me. That goes a little bit far, but there's a sense in which it does make you the person that you are, and it gives you a set of sensibilities that you can bring back to your real life. I don't want to put that in quotes, but you bring to your real life and share with other people. Right. And that's a great mercy. It's a great mercy and a blessing. And the world is full of people who perish for the simple want of that kind of experience.
Right. I hear that. So in your interaction with this culture, with this group of people that just basically shed their inner editor as much as they could and started shipping off cassettes to, well, they shipped them off to Option Magazine, but you also would trade among other people, right?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
And so, is that how much did you get to know people just because they randomly sent you a cassette and you picked up the conversation from there?
That's actually pretty surprising. There are, I wouldn't say a substantial number, but there's a lot of sort of relationships and people who helped to form my current sensibility, particularly with respect to things like technology, that I met that way. In fact, the one that I still keep going back with and just kind of shaking my head in dumb surprise is back in the late 70s and early 80s, I would probably have to say that one of my very favorite labels in the entire world, like full stop, was Palace of Lights in Seattle. It was a little cassette label that went to doing LPs later on. The first work of theirs that I ever encountered was this thing called Music for Land and Water, which was just exquisite. Do you know what I mean? That sort of thing where you see, even microcultures have this feature about them that work tends to kind of cluster. And for whatever reasons, despite people who are in different parts of the country, they wind up doing work that kind of resembles each other. And it's not a new thing. If we looked at corresponding communities in the 17th century, people who wrote letters to each other, we'd find the same thing. It just happens that we're talking about cassettes now. But in the midst of those things, even in those little microcultures, you'd get something that would just like the hairs on the back of your neck would stand up when you heard it. You just thought, oh man, this is, it's this kind of combination, at least for me. I'm sure everybody else in the world is different. Instead of saying like, I could do that, or how do I do that? Like my first response to it is this kind of like wonder at the wholeness of it. And then much later, after you recover, the thing is over and you count 5 and draw a breath. And then you say like something like either, where did that come from? Or what is that? Right? So Palace of Lights was like one of those things. And so it would be, to this day, I do that. There are authors, there are writers I always buy in hardback. Because somehow or other, we kind of made some connections. So from then on, anything they do, I'll pick up. I won't look at the reviews. I won't look at anything about it. I'll just get it because my sense is that there are people that I trust. And one of the astounding things for me, like I can't believe this happened to me, was I grew up and I'm now on Palace of Lights. Do you know what I mean? That's sort of like saying, yes, I now record for ECM.
Right.
It's that kind of thing. And that's been one of the great pleasures of my life. A lot of the people who taught me analog synthesis were people that I met in Cassette Culture. It was a great thing. And also when the time came that I started doing my radio show, it turned out that the work that I knew from that period of time was really the beginning. That was the beginning of the work that I programmed.
Let's talk a little bit more about your radio show. How long has it been going now?
Oh, man. Let's see. My wife, probably 1986.
Oh, my goodness.
I know.
So getting on 20 years.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
30 years.
Or 30 years. Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. I don't even feel like I shouldn't be 30 years old yet.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's kind of like, ugh. And since it sounds scary, here's the only way I can actually do it. I just think of it as something I did once a week for a really long time.
Right.
Yeah?
Yep.
And still do.
Well, so you kind of say that like some of what you experienced with some of what you experienced in your Cassette Culture days was kind of informative in your radio show. First of all, why don't you explain to people what the name of the show is, what kind of stuff we program,
okay,
and how they could listen to it if they chose to.
No problem. A number of you listening probably know what community radio is. It's sort of volunteer-sponsored community. It's kind of like a slightly different step sideways from public radio. But in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, we have a community radio station that's been on the air for, 35, maybe 40. It's been a long time. But basically, I started working there. I substituted for someone for part of a year starting in the mid-'80s, and I've been on the air since about 1986 with a couple of breaks when I moved abroad to live with my wife. And so I do a weekly radio program. It used to be on from 8 to 10. It's now on from 9 to 11 Central Daylight Standard Time, and it is streamed if you're ever interested in listening to it. It's a program of really, by now, whatever I want to program. Back when I started doing the show, the idea was I was supposed to do a show that followed It came after a show of world music, which in the 1980s, world music was not global pop. World music was like ethnographic recordings
Right.
and folk singers,
Yeah.
right? And then there was a guy that came on after me, another of my great teachers, Bill Milos, who did this great show called System Considerations that was much more, compared to the Clancy Brothers and Ghanaian funeral music, which was sort of what the world music show was.
Mm-hmm.
Bill's show was kind of like tape loops of power tools and stuff like that. So the woman who's the music director said, we've got a problem here at the station. We'd like to do a show that started out sounding a little bit like the world music show. And then over a couple of hours, it can get like weirder and stranger so that when the 2 hours is up, people will keep the radio on for the next show. Could you do
Right.
that? And I thought, yeah. But of course now I'm on after the gospel
Yeah,
show.
I was going to say it's clear to me that perception that you had to be sort of like a bridge is totally out the
Oh,
window
it's gone. It's
because
totally
you're
gone.
led in
Yeah.
by an all out gospel show,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
and then afterwards is the noise
Yep.
fest.
Yep. So the great thing about my station, and I'm going to stop talking about myself and brag about my radio station for just a minute, is we have what I believe to be the single largest swath of experimental music programming on the radio anywhere that I know of. We start at 9 o'clock on Sunday evening and we go until dawn the next morning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's extraordinary stuff. And again, it's listener-sponsored community radio, which means that we're able to do it because we have listeners who really think that that's an important thing to do and who, in turn, trust us as programmers. So for me, first, it's a ball to do. I mean, because all I really do is say, I have all this great stuff, and I'm playing records for my friends.
Right.
That's really, really what I'm doing. But also, I'm paying back every single person that loaned me something cool or came to me and said something like, either like, I know you're going to think this is weird, but, or who said, I think you might actually like this. And of course, if I didn't, then they'd say, wow, why didn't, we'd
Right.
have those conversations. And a lot of those people are no longer in my life. Some of them sadly have passed away, and I will never, ever be able to properly thank them for the tremendous gift of their time and their generosity. And the only thing you can do in a case like that is pay that baby forward. And so that's one of the reasons I still do it, is because I ain't paid that gift back yet. And there's almost nothing, with the possible exception of playing for people and making them happy, there's almost nothing in the world that is more monetarily not useful, but personally astoundingly satisfying as sharing something with somebody and watching the clouds crack open, or watching their pupils dilate, or watching them kind of like raise their head and stare off into space and think they got it.
Right.
That's what makes you keep doing art, and it's what makes you write about it. It's what makes you share it, and it's one of the greatest things human beings get to do. Period. Full stop.
That's really a great way to think about it, and to stay committed to it, because doing anything for 3 decades is a kind of commitment that isn't necessarily easy to fulfill.
Well, yeah, except that, people. You probably know people who have pursued sobriety for a long time, or people
Right.
who have had great goals, or people who have had long-term, nourishing primary relationships. And one of the things that they all say is something about the idea that they do it a little tiny piece at a time. That
Right.
every chance you have to choose in the name of loyalty, or choose what is good and beautiful instead of something else, that every time you have a chance to make that little choice, then that's the choice you make. And doing that choice over and over and over makes something happen.
Right.
Man, we have
That's
not said
something.
anything about gear or music, have we?
No, not yet. But
I'm so sorry.
No, but that tends to be the way that this goes, because the fact of the matter is, the internet is a really good way to exchange information about gear. So I can do a blog post or a post on Muff Wiggler or whatever and blurt out something about gear, and someone else will blurt something back out, and we can exchange gear stuff real easily. The internet turns out not to be a very good mechanism for talking about things like creativity and influences and the way that we mature as artists, right?
Yeah, it doesn't help us with that. You're right.
Yeah. And so it's funny, but I think that tends to be when people start talking, they realize, oh, I can actually communicate about this or ask questions about this or whatever. But I can explore this area that just isn't something I get to do in my day-to-day run.
Well, the other stuff is much harder. It's much harder work.
Yeah.
As wonderful as it is, and man, it is having access to this like huge, broad, relatively flat or shallow information space is, I mean, you don't want to say we live in the golden age, but in some respects, it's astounding that that's the case. But one of the things that happens is you realize that that also means that there's this really special kind of crazy that comes from having too much choice, and also from having not enough trusted agents. Boy, that sounds kind of more marketese than I would really want. But the idea of somebody whose advice goes beyond what you can write down about something. Right. So for me, one of the things I've decided to take some really tiny steps toward personally is, partially in an attempt to surprise myself again, after years and years and years, I've gone back to looking at analog synthesis. And one of the things about it that's insanely bewildering, it's both great and bewildering, is the number of options available to me are a whole lot bigger. Things are more idiosyncratic and peculiar, and all of those idiosyncratic and peculiar things, the 1,000 choices I have, because back in the old days in Bulgaria, there was only one kind of oscillator, and it only had one kind of waveform, and man, those days are gone. But right. The thing you don't have is the person that you talk to after you read the stuff, the person that will tell you the silly thing that resonates with you, the person that will say, so here's a piece of advice from you. I will use Darwin Gross as an example of what trusted agents tell you that technical specifications don't, because I was thinking about this today. We were talking at some point, Darwin and I were talking about filters, because it turns out he and I both really like filters. We're really interested in them. And I was talking about what kinds of filters would fit in the rack and how they'd work. And Darwin said something that nobody else so far had said to me. And after he told me this, I thought about it. And every time I looked at a filter after this, I checked it out. And here's what he told me. He said, well, the thing about filters, one of the things about filters that really bothers me is like you've got this whole range on the knob. And there's a whole bunch of filters where there's only like 4 places on the knob that the filter does much. Or there'll be like a full third of a turn or a quarter of a turn on the knob where nothing really happens that you can hear. So that really bothers me. No technical specification will tell you that. In fact, and I've looked for it. I've actually gone online and I've looked. And looking at the YouTube videos doesn't show you that either. But you know what? That turns out to be really important. And it's just like a dumb thing nobody talks about. It's like, what's the throw on the dial do? Because that's this weird combination of like, what's in your ear, what's under your fingers, and how your physical relationship with the technology maps to what you hear. That's what trusted agents tell you, and that's what all of those gear lists don't tell you.
Right. I think that there's another really important thing that's kind of an adjunct to that, which is that the way that like modular systems are now, but the way that a lot of sort of piece part technology stuff works, is that you used to have to buy one person's vision. So you and I were buying keyboards at roughly the same time in our early days.
Oh yeah.
So like if you bought into the Oberheim game,
Yep.
you bought into Tom Oberheim's vision of how knobs worked and buttons pressed and key beds played. And if you were an Oberheim guy, you bought into the Oberheim stuff.
That's
And
true.
if you were a Moog guy, you'd try the Oberheim and be like, Jesus, I don't know why the knob works this way, and I gotta
Yeah,
press so hard.
the filters sure sound good though.
Right, right. And you would end up have sort of like embracing a guy's or a company, but in most cases, those companies were an extension of a guy. You really bought into that guy's vision of how everything works. Now, if you happen to put together a system that's all from one person, people look at you like, wow, you weren't very creative when you looked at that, you know?
Oh,
And
or
so instead you're
or
mixing
you
and
could
matching.
argue that I think like the guy who designs everything for make noise or mutable instruments or whatever.
Hmm.
You're right though, in the sense that one of the great things about the landscape that we see before us is that back in the day, you used to have to choose based on efficiency or a small number of things that were available. And that, especially with the explosion of software, that's particularly different. You can now choose something based on your emotional comfort with how a piece of software works. Or, if, for example, if you're a strong supporter of the notion of open source software, you can use some ideological idea to basically guide your choice of tools.
Right.
That's an astounding, uh, I think that's an astoundingly wonderful thing to do. And we're certainly not going to spend all of our time talking about gear, but I think I would say that if I think about the tools that I use now, and obviously Maximus P and Jitter that's the bulk of my performing and creating life. That is true. But instead of endorsing that long and hard and turning this into some kind of marketing thing, I would say something else about it. And that is, I started using it because I started using it before I worked for the company. And when I encountered it, it was a presentation in an upstairs room in a building in the city of Utrecht in 1989, done by Kort Lippy and Zach Settle, that somebody had told me about. I'd taken the train in from The Hague. It was a school day for me, and I got in and I sat in this room and I saw them showed this thing that in those days was called the patcher.
Hmm.
And the patcher had this thing where there were these boxes and you could connect A to B to C, and they were jokey and funny. But the thing that I kept thinking about, I kept watching, was this idea that you could also connect C to B to A or B to A to C. That there
Right.
was something about that idea that everything about it was configurable that really got me thinking about the idea that the person that designs the software you use, in the same case as the instrument, sets some kind of agenda. And to me, that was the seed. Like 1989 is the little seed in my head that was planted that said, you know, this could be different. You could do this yourself. And if you did it yourself, then, well, if you screwed up, it would be your fault. But you don't have to take somebody else's word for it. And that's that's one of those insights. That's one of those like aesthetic insights that delivered me to where I am today.
Well, let's talk about where that is today because so you're one of the people I know that has built sort of a monolithic performance system.
I sure don't think of it that way, but sure, you're
Well, I
right.
mean,
I
in
do.
comparison to me, so I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people that use Max or Reactor or other building type tools tend to make small, sort of like tactical bits and pieces, and then for each gig you kind of tack together the pieces that make
Ah,
sense,
yeah.
and you perform that way.
The
You,
patch is the performance, or the patch is the piece.
yeah, the patch is the piece, right? You have used Max to create what I would simply say is your idiosyncratic view of a single piece of software that represents your performance.
Yeah, and nobody could be more surprised by that than I am, I guess. Yes, but you're absolutely right. I did, and
Why
I
are you
think
surprised by it?
because I would have said, it's sort of like drop me in the time machine and send me back 20, 25 years to talk to the kid that I was. Like he would have answered the door and said, "What's this old bald guy doing on my doorstep?" And I would have said, "Kid, you gotta, you think about giving yourself advice in the past." I would have thought that I would grow up and be one of those people that made one patch per piece. I just always assumed it was going to be what I was. And I think what wound up happening was I started I started hearing recordings because here's the problem. I live in the Midwest of the United States, so my opportunity to see people perform is relatively limited. And also, I'm a radio programmer, so often works of art would be mediated by recorded instantiations rather than seeing people live. But over time, I began to realize that there was this thing that some of the people that I really respected were doing. And I wasn't sure I could do it myself, but I respected it enough to think about trying it. And it kind of took a couple of forms. The first form was that they made instruments that changed slowly. So instead of building one patch per piece, what you'd do is you'd build a thing and you'd start with it. And then after a couple of performances or a couple of recordings, you'd say, I spent a lot of time on this, but this little bit of it doesn't really work. And the part that was really crucial for getting me to start thinking that way was I realized that a lot of the people that I respected were able to kind of be light on their feet. And compared to, there's a lot of people that are much lighter on their feet than I am. Many of whom I play with, Jeff Kaiser comes immediately to mind, who's dances like Fred Astaire, for Pete's sake. But there was this idea that those people had this notion that the controllers that they used, instead of having those things matched per piece or per performance, the controllers were fixed enough that the idea of thinking about what to do next was something that was under your fingers instead of on the screen. You still needed the screen to see what it was. Right. But to me, the first time I saw John Jano, perform with radio, the lights went on because I realized that what I was seeing was the things he was doing or the way that he could think as he worked was possible because stuff was under his fingers. It Right. wasn't software on a screen. It was a thing that was in his hands. And I thought, oh crap, that's I bet, by this time my Max was good enough where I thought, I guess I could actually do that, couldn't I? Mm-hmm. And so I worked real hard and I got something set up. And then after a couple of gigs, I thought, well, this part that I work, and of course, it's always the part you work the hardest on, right? It's like you have this great idea and you set it up and it sounds terrible.
Right.
Right. But very gradually, the little pieces, the little stuff that I made, and the things that I would have thought I'd spend my whole life reproducing new versions of, kind of coalesced into things that were the way that I thought. They weren't. It wasn't like they coalesced into verse forms like a villanelle or a haiku or something like that, where you have this like shared verse form that everyone in the world writes in. But It was more this kind of like collections of phrases and things that made sense to me, and they were the things that I thought with instead of the things that I thought about.
Okay.
And to me, that's the point at which I started thinking about making instruments. And I was pretty far into doing it before I realized that I didn't necessarily know a lot of people who did that, because it seemed to me at the time, and this is probably one of the reasons that I'm not wildly famous, by the way. Here's another good piece of advice to those of you seeking worldly fame and fortune. I realized that the other part of building the instrument was I had to absolutely be sure that I could fail.
Right.
That was really, really, really important.
Well, that's kind of interesting because an awful lot of people use technology, especially in performance, use technology as a way to avoid failure.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Well, so come to think of it, so do I. I do try to write software that won't crash the second I start using it. But there's this other notion that you have, how do we say this? of the possible choices you have, it's really tempting, especially because we don't have a typology for instruments yet. So software instruments, we joke about reading email sitting at your laptop, but the truth is there's not a uniformly acceptable idea of what playing a laptop as an instrument means, which means virtuosity is really hard to determine for an audience. And if you're interested as a performer in having an audience think you're awesome while you're doing something, instead of getting to the end of what you perform and saying, God, that had like form and shape and logic to it. If you want people to think he's really doing something, then you configure his software so that you choose, three obvious things to do. You map those to three giant gestures, like the giant, the slot machine knob on the side of your interface, or the biggest knob or fader that you have. And then you like punch the air with one hand and goof with that fader, when in fact, nothing is at risk.
Right.
So for a very long time, I don't do it anymore, but for a very long time, I had a button on my software instrument. And this is true confession time, and some of my collaborators will probably be surprised, amused, and possibly disgusted to hear this. The big red button in the upper left-hand corner of my machine randomly loaded sound files. So what I said was, if I'm going to do this, when I started doing live performance, and I can think of it now, I was insane. I said, I will walk out on stage with nothing.
Right.
I'll have a thing running that I understand, but it'll just be loaded up with stuff, and half of it'll be Indonesian, a bunch of it'll be bird calls, there'll be ice in a martini glass, and I'm just going to have to do something with that. And happily working with other players let me get away from that a little bit, because they would do that.
Right.
And they had a better set of sounds than I did, or they had things I didn't know, whereas all the junk on my hard disk was always, there were a million of them, and if I was really lucky, I'd forget some of them. But I set that up, whereas sitting down to play with like you and Tom Hamer and Mark Henriksen, the quartet, I have no idea what you guys are going to do, and that it fulfills it meets that same need. Now,
Right.
Does that mean I can do the same thing over again? No, not really. But, and that may be the reason why the Grammy nominations have been few and far between. But that's okay. That's fine.
Well, Gregory, boy, there's so much stuff here. We didn't get a chance to talk about your work with the gamelan.
Or sonology.
Or sonology. I really want to dive into that because I don't even know really what that means. I just heard about it.
I can do that for you in 30 seconds.
Oh, you know what, though? I don't want to do a 30-second version of it. So
Okay.
I'll tell you what. Let's plan on getting back together again in a couple of weeks and literally exploring that kind of in its own episode. Sound good?
All right. If that's okay with everybody. I mean, for those of you out there listening, I promise it'll be a very different kind of discussion than the ranty stuff that I've just.
Well, but this is really great because the fact of the matter is, another thing to me that the internet isn't really good at is it isn't a good medium for understanding people's well thought out decision making process. Right? You either get to hear the rant and you just assume somebody's a crazy old coot. Or else you hear completely bland stuff because people don't want to offend anyone. So we get either the most bland of things or a complete Unabomber style rantings. And so,
I think that you always worry about offending people. But the other part of it, to me, and this to me has been one of the successes of your podcast. Like when I think of, I was really nervous about doing this because I've heard probably everyone you've done so far. And the thing that I wound up thinking about when I leave the good ones is, something about the person, even if you didn't know their work, something about them. If you know their work is embedded in some way. And it's embedded in the idea that there's this person who cares about what they do. And even if you're talking to people who are talking about something that's peculiar to you, if you can get people to talk about what they love, then you can kind of get a sense of what it might be like for you to love the thing that they talk about.
Right. That's true.
And that to
That's
me
true.
has been the great thing that this podcast, to me personally, as a listener, has done over and over and over.
Well, thank
People
you.
that I think I
Thanks.
know, even.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It definitely is a labor of love for me, but it's also one of those things where I truly can say that after every conversation that I have, I come away not only knowing that person better, but I also tend to learn something about myself as well. Whether it's a reaction to something that they said, or a recognition of a parallel life, or whatever, I always find ways to learn to come out of it. What I at least hope is a better person than when I went in. So.
Well, so perhaps the future promise of a discussion about things like looking at programs like the Institute for Sonology in the Netherlands, which is woefully underappreciated, I think, in the history of electronic music, and also looking at the collisions between electronic and experimental music and non-Western traditions. Yeah, you know what? I think those are really crucial and personally interesting to me, and I think they might be interesting to other people as well.
I think so too.
Yeah.
So we'll plan on doing that soon.
Okay, I hope so.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And this is a fascinating conversation.
Thanks a lot. I don't think I went where I thought we might go, but it felt like a pretty great trip. Actually.
Yeah, it did. It did indeed. All right. So thanks a lot, and I will talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Well, and there's another one in the books. I want to thank Gregory for spending the time to chat with me. It was a lot of fun. Really kind of explored some outlier territory there, which is always a good time. Again, I want to thank all the listeners for sticking in there. I had some great listenership this last week. Do me a favor, though. If you have some friends that haven't been turned on to it yet, drop them a line and say, hey, check out this podcast. There's some really interesting people getting interviewed. Or conversed with, as I prefer to say. Otherwise, thanks a lot for your time, and I will talk to you next week.